Good morning. It's good to see you all here, and everybody that's here on Zoom also. I'm sorry. YouTube. My name is Judy Burgett. I serve on the worship committee. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll be the worship associate for you this morning. We have a few announcements in the beginning. Our congregational meeting will be May 22nd beginning at 12:30. It will be conducted in person and on Zoom, and the information is found in the newsletter. Next second Monday lunch is going to be on June 13th at the Seasons Bar and Grill in Knoxville. There are some ongoing religious exploration offerings on Zoom. On Wednesday nights, there is Thinking About Theology, and on Thursday evenings at 6:30 is General Conversations, and the Zoom link for both of these is in the newsletter. And now Bridget will come up and talk to us about her yoga.
Hey everybody, now I'm an official yoga teacher, so I'm starting my yoga back here on, let me look at the dates to make sure I don't say the wrong thing. May the 29th, which is the last Sunday of this month, June 12th and June 26th, and I personally, my yoga feels like a ministry, and I want you to pay me with love, so you can give me a hug, you can love me. If you want to give me money, you can, but there's no, you have to pay me this amount to come to my class, because I want everybody to be able to enjoy it. And so, the theme for that class is the first one is going to be like on women's rights / women power or something. I haven't got it fully developed, but that's what I want to do the first one as, because there's a lot going on right now with women's rights. So we will start back on Sunday, May the 29th, and we'll do it right after service, and everybody's invited, and I'll try to do maybe a crossover where we can see how we do laying and chair, where more people can enjoy it also. So thank you.
There's just one more announcement. There will be a Spirit Quest 2022 at the Elkmont Group Camp in the Smoky Mountain National Park. It'll be with August 5th to the 8th with Reverend Carol. There'll be an opportunity to gather with others who love being in the land, and the registration link is in the newsletter. And that concludes the announcements. We will have some gathering music by Sandra Thomas. Will be I've Got Peace Like a River.
Thank you, Sandra. Good morning. My name is Linda Fippin. I think most of you know me. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm going to be doing today's service in the tradition of Unitarian Universalism. We fairly frequently have services by the lay members, and this is one of them. So now I'm going to take the Himalayan bowl and sound it, and while we do this, if you can bring yourselves to a peaceful place, be fully present, and open your mind and your hearts.
Linda will light our chalice, and I have a few words. It's called Why We're Here by Eric Walker Hickstrom. Here today in this place and with these people, may we listen so that we can hear. May we hear so that we can feel. May we feel so that we can know, and may we know so that we can change ourselves and this world. May this chalice we light our way.
Before the choir comes up, I just wanted to say a word about the music that we're doing this morning. We don't have any Ukrainian music in our hymnal. What we've chosen is a tune that was written by the Finnish composer Jan Sibelius from his work Finlandia. And this music is important, it's sort of relevant to what we're talking about today, because people feel that Sibelius's music helped the Finnish people to establish their national identity and their independence from Russia. So I'll have the choir come up. looks like we kind of already did our offering, so which was in the service this way, so we'll just move on. If you looked at a newspaper or the television or online news source or listened to the radio this morning, you would surely have seen or heard a story about the war in Ukraine. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, the news has been full of stories about Ukraine and its people enduring the ravages of war. We see images of the Ukrainians as victims, as refugees, or as political leaders or soldiers. But most of us know little about the Ukrainian people themselves. And there is some hazard in seeing the suffering of people about whom we know little. It may become too easy to regard them as distant strangers whose troubles we can push aside. Today, I am going to try to acquaint you with these distant strangers and hope that you will want to say, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. Every culture emerges from a tangled web of geography and history. The effect of geography on Ukraine and the Ukrainians is a clear example of this. It is a large country, as European countries go, about the size of Texas. The majority of the landscape is open grassland called steppe, or a mix of steppe and forest. There are only a few mountains, and those lie in the far west and in the Crimean Peninsula. These sweeping steppes without mountainous barriers offered an open door to invaders from every quarter. River systems running north to south, especially the Dnieper, which flows through the entire country to empty into the Black Sea, were routes of invasion, but were also important trade routes from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. These trade routes played a pivotal role in the development of Ukraine as a country. There were people living in what is now Ukraine long before there were any Slavic people there. Archaeologists have found evidence of people living in the area more than 30,000 years ago. The first well-documented agriculturalists lived there some 6,000 years ago. Beginning in about the 10th century BCE, a succession of peoples from Asia moved in and occupied the region. And in the 7th century BCE, Greek colonies also rose along the Black Sea coast. In the beginning of the first millennium of the current Common Era, Goths invaded from the north and Huns invaded from the east. And it wasn't until the 5th or 6th centuries that Slavs began migrating out of the Carpathian Mountains in the west. Some went west and some went south, but the East Slavs went eastward into northern Ukraine and southern Belarus. It is these East Slavs that eventually became today's Ukrainians, as well as Belarusians and Russians. So 15 or 1600 years is a lot of history. Even a thumbnail view of the entire history of Ukraine is beyond the scope of a Sunday morning talk. But there are a few key events, individuals, and themes that stand out as critically important in shaping the character of the Ukrainian people. The first of these was the arrival of the Varangians in the 9th century of the Common Era, who came down from the north following the trade routes. These outsiders are referred to as Vikings or merchant warriors, or sometimes the Rus, possibly an Old Norse word meaning men who row. They were Norsemen, predominantly Swedes, who settled around Kiev, which had already been established by the East Slavs and was a particularly strategic site along the Dnieper River trade route. They quite quickly abandoned their Norseness, became Slavicized, and established a dynasty known as the Kievan Rus. They so successfully expanded their territory that by the end of the 10th century, it extended north to the Baltic Sea and northeast to the Volga River basin, and consisted of a loose confederation of principalities. It was in the Kievan Rus that the first really significant figure in Ukrainian history arose during the 10th century. This was Volodymyr the Great. Besides being the ruler of a now large territory, he is most important for converting from pagan beliefs to Christianity. And in the year 988, he made Byzantine Christianity the state religion of the Kievan Rus. As early as the 12th century, some regions of the Kievan Rus that bordered on other countries had started to be called Ukraine. Ukraine literally means borderland, which is why until recently it was usually referred to as the Ukraine, that is, the borderland, much as we say the Netherlands today. The Kievan Rus eventually declined in power due to changes in trade routes, succession disputes, struggles with some of the principalities, and further invasions by central nomadic tribes. The final blow was delivered by the Mongol Tatar invasions in the 13th century that culminated in the sacking of Kiev in 1240. What followed was several centuries of rule by not only the Golden Horde of the Mongol Tatars, but by Ukraine's neighbors, Lithuania and Poland, among whom there was a long-lasting tug-of-war over the control of Ukraine. Cossacks also figure prominently in the history of Ukraine. When I think of Cossacks, the image that comes to mind is fierce mounted riders running down peasants in the service of the Russian Empire. But their place in Ukrainian history is quite different. The word Cossack comes from a Turkic word Cossack, meaning adventurer or free man. And the original people called Cossacks were Central Asians who spoke Turkic languages and lived in the southern steppes. However, during the 15th century, other adventurers, including peasants fleeing serfdom and displaced members of the nobility of neighboring countries, came to the steppes for hunting and fishing and to escape their former lives. They remained in the region and eventually formed a Cossack military organization. Interestingly, these Cossacks had a sort of democratic form of governance, with an assembly called a Rada and officers chosen by election, including their commander-in-chief or hetman. Poland, which ruled Ukraine at that time, tried to use the Cossacks as a military force, but found them to be difficult to control. For the Cossacks had begun to think of themselves as having rights and liberties, and staged several revolts against the Poles, culminating in a full-scale uprising of the Cossacks and peasants in 1648. The Cossack hetman, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, having led the Cossacks and other rebels to defeat the Poles in several battles, entered Kiev in 1649 as a liberator of the Ukrainian people. Khmelnytsky thought of Ukraine as an independent state and set about organizing its structure, although this did prove to be unsuccessful. In fact, after his death in 1657, Ukraine fell into a prolonged period of chaos so bad that it was known as the Ruin. During this chaotic period, Ukraine was divided along the Dnieper River, with the West Bank ceded to Poland and Russia claiming the East Bank and the city of Kiev. Unsurprisingly, this was not popular with the Ukrainians, and further chaos ensued. The next 100 years or so was a period of shifting alliances and various arrangements with Tsarist Russia, the complexity of which will make your head spin or perhaps put you to sleep. But it eventually led to the Russian imperial control of Ukraine. The important thing to note about this period and the years leading up to it is that the Ukrainian people had already begun to think of themselves as a free and independent state. And they look back to the Cossacks as prime movers of this vision of independence. Just listen to the closing words of the Ukrainian national anthem. We'll lay down our souls and our bodies to attain our freedom, and we'll show that we, brothers, are of the Cossack nation. Despite the Ukrainians' desire for independence, their attempts to achieve it have quite recently been thwarted again and again. There was a period during the early years of Russian imperial rule during which Ukraine was relatively autonomous and experienced a period of cultural revival, particularly in art, music, and architecture. But that came to an end in the reign of the Russian Tsar Peter the Great in the 18th century. During the 19th century, there was another upwelling of Ukrainian culture and literature. Ukraine's best-known poet, Taras Shevchenko, who was born in 1814, wrote poetry celebrating Ukrainian nationalist feelings. His works and that of other emerging authors with similar views led the Russian government to suppress the use of the Ukrainian language and replace it with Russian. By the end of the 19th century, oppression, injustice, poverty in both Ukraine and Russia made an uprising and revolution inevitable and ultimately led to the Russian Revolution, the fall of the Tsar and his empire, and the eventual rise of the Soviet Union. In all of this turmoil, Ukraine was able to gain a period of independence, again, from 1918 to 1922. But this ended when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was established by the communists. Ukraine became one of the 4 original Soviet republics, and it was once again only part of another country, and was to remain so for nearly 70 years. During those 70 years, Ukraine and its people were to experience many tragic events. In the 1930s, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin embarked on an ambitious plan to industrialize and to abolish individual farms in favor of collective farms where previous landholders would work. Many farmers who had worked their own lands for generations rebelled. These rebellions were put down, the farmers' grain and livestock were seized, and the farmers themselves were sent to Siberia or other remote places. The remaining farmers were subject to impossible grain quotas, and when they failed to meet them, the authorities seized whatever grain and crops the farmers had, leaving nothing to feed the populace. This led to what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor, or the Great Famine, in which an estimated 4 to 5 million Ukrainians died of starvation. World War II caused further suffering to the Ukrainian people. When the German army invaded in 1941, the Ukrainians initially graded them as liberators from the oppression of Soviet Russia. But the Nazis were actually intent on seizing the rich farmland of Ukraine for Germany. They captured thousands of peasants and sent them to labor camps in Germany, while their farms were taken over by German farmers. Some Ukrainians turned back to the Soviets and even joined their army, but others chose to fight both the Nazis and the Soviets in the Ukrainian insurgent army. In addition to seizing the farmlands and destroying the towns and villages of Ukraine, the Nazis also took aim at the Jewish population. Accompanying the German army were special armed groups whose mission was to seek out and kill any Jews they found. Nearly 1 million Jews were murdered in Ukraine during the war. Overall, the war resulted in the deaths of nearly 7 million Ukrainians. In the long post-war years in which the Soviet Union and the West engaged in the Cold War, the economic status of the USSR and its republics, including Ukraine, steadily declined. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the USSR and launched the policies of glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet republics began to have more freedom, and nationalist feelings again began to rise. As we all know, the Soviet Union continued to crumble and eventually collapsed in December 1991. But by that time, Ukraine had already declared its independence in August of 1991. Independence did not bring freedom from problems. Soviet-era infrastructure and industries were crumbling, the industrial regions were severely polluted, and corruption was rampant in many aspects of life and politics. There was political strife, controversies over election results, and massive protests starting in the 2000s. In 2014, the Crimean Parliament voted to secede from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation, after which Russia seized Crimea. That same year, the Russian-leaning president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, fled to Russia. He was replaced by a billionaire, Petro Poroshenko, who had little success in governing because the Ukrainians felt that the government was corrupt. In 2019, he was defeated in the presidential election by Volodymyr Zelensky, now a familiar figure around the world, who ran on an anti-corruption platform. And 3 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So clearly, the Ukrainian people have been through a lot over the past 15 or 16 centuries. But the thing that stood out to me about Ukraine is that its people, despite being thwarted over and over, have maintained their desire to be an independent country and assert their identity as a people, no matter how many times Vladimir Putin says Ukraine is not really a country and Ukrainians are really just Russians. So what does make a Ukrainian Ukrainian and not Russian? There are some obvious similarities. Both have East Slavic heritage and speak an East Slavic language. Ukrainian and Russian are very closely related, but Ukrainian has been considerably influenced by Polish. This, in part, makes the languages asymmetrically intelligible. That is, Ukrainian speakers can understand and speak Russian better than Russians can understand and speak Ukrainian. However, many people in Ukraine do speak Russian, in large part because it was the administrative language throughout the Soviet era and was taught in schools. Some Ukrainians even consider both Ukrainian and Russian to be their native language. Also, religious people in both countries are predominantly Eastern Orthodox Christians, though the Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches are separate denominations. Many traditional foods are similar in both countries, such as borscht, various dumplings and breads, and stuffed cabbage. But Ukraine and its people have characteristics and traditions that make them singularly Ukrainian. I'm going to digress a little bit here and talk about the diaspora of Ukrainians. Given the history of Ukraine, it should be no surprise that many of its people emigrated. In particular, many Jews left Ukraine in the late 19th century to escape discrimination, persecution, and violent pogroms. More fled the Holocaust during World War II, and still more left for Israel at the end of the Soviet era. Some Ukrainians went to neighboring countries, but many came to Canada and the US. Canada actually has the largest Ukrainian population outside of Ukraine itself and Russia, and the US has almost as many. In fact, America saw its first Ukrainian immigrant when a man named Ivan Bohman arrived in Jamestown in 1608. Many Ukrainians who had been living in Russia during the Soviet era returned to Ukraine after it became independent in a sort of reverse diaspora. As a result of the diaspora, many notable Americans have Ukrainian heritage, including Leonard Bernstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Alex Trebek, Mike Ditka, and Dustin Hoffman, as well as fiddler and mandolinist Peter Ostrushko, who will be familiar to Prairie Home Companion listeners. Okay, going back to what makes Ukrainians and Ukraine unique. The steppe land of Ukraine is itself unusual. You may have heard Ukraine called the breadbasket of Europe. That is because it has some of the richest farmland in the world. In fact, the Ukrainian flag represents the blue sky over golden fields of wheat. As in our Midwest, prairie grasses growing for millennia made the soil extremely deep and fertile. Many important crops are grown, especially wheat, barley, corn, potatoes, soybeans, and sunflowers, the national flower of Ukraine. So let's look at some of the Ukrainian culture and traditions. Ukrainians have a vibrant tradition of folk arts. Perhaps you have seen the ornately decorated Ukrainian Easter eggs called pisanki, or traditional floral patterned embroidery and ceramics. Many Ukrainians take part in folk music choruses and folk dance groups. and Ukrainian professional dance troupes in their richly embroidered costumes perform internationally. If you have ever seen one of their performances, you will doubtless have marveled at the hopak, a very dramatic dance in which male dancers leap around the floor in ways that seem almost impossible. Ukraine also has its own rich tradition of music and literature, although neither is widely known in the West. Ironically, probably the best-known Ukrainian author is Nikolai Gogol, and he wrote in Russian and is generally considered a Russian author. But there is plenty of Ukrainian fiction and nonfiction available in English translation. This is a hint to the book club. Probably the best-known Ukrainian composer is Mikola Lisenko, who is considered to be the father of Ukrainian classical music. I encourage you to search on YouTube and look for a Prayer for Ukraine, a beautiful and moving choral piece composed by Lisenko. While you're there on YouTube, you might also look for Violinists Support Ukraine, a video in which 94 violinists from around the world accompany Ukrainian violinists playing a traditional folk tune from their basement shelters. Whether you know it or not, you have been listening to one Ukrainian song for years. This tune was adapted by Ukrainian composer Mikola Lisenko from an ancient chant celebrating spring. His original words also celebrated spring, but an American choral director named Peter Wilhowsky rewrote the lyrics to produce the familiar Christmas song, Carol of the Bells, which is also popular in Ukraine, where it is a New Year's song. Ukraine also has a lively pop music scene that you can sample on the music streaming services. So even with this capsule view of Ukraine, its history and culture and people, one can see that Ukrainians are like other people, including Russians, and yet different and unique. They have suffered and persevered and held on to their hopes and dreams, but yet again face an uncertain future. And I hope that this look at the people of Ukraine may help us to feel a kinship with them as other human beings and not just as pawns in a geopolitical struggle. I'm going to end with part of a poem by Taras Shevchenko, the 19th century poet who championed Ukrainian independence and for which he was arrested and imprisoned. I think it encapsulates the way many Ukrainians feel about their country. When I die, bury me on a grave mound amid the wide, wide steppe in my beloved Ukraine, in a place where the wide-tilled fields and the Dnieper and its steep banks can be seen and its roaring rapids heard. So, before we close and extinguish the chalice, I do want to say a couple more things. If you should wish to donate to help Ukraine and its people, there are lots of charities. There are also some scammers. The website Charity Navigator is a good way to find legitimate charities and has a specific section to Ukraine. Also, I tried my hand at some Ukrainian baking. So there are some honey cookies called medyaniki and sweet turnovers called piroshki in the back there. And I think that we have some coffee?
Yes, not much.
Not much, okay. But before that, we did the offering. It was taken during the choir singing, so they were so eager to offer that we just but we can have some closing music then. Well,
Catherine, I know that song. What's the name?
Her voice is still and small.
So I'm going to ask Judy to extinguish the chalice, and I have a few closing words. These are words from Maddie Stefantis, and it's called "We Keep Its Light in Our Hearts." We extinguish this flame, but we keep its light in our hearts with its message of love and justice, taking it outside these walls to the world we live in until we are together again. Go in peace.